name is Helen Christians, and I will be your MC this morning. I'd like to welcome you to the Sunday morning meeting of the Humanists of Greater Portland. The Humanists of Greater Portland is a chapter of the American Humanists Association. And as humanists, our members believe in a progressive philosophy that without supernaturalism advocates living an ethical life based on science, reason, and free inquiry. The American Humanist Association has developed a list of 10 commitments, and these commitments are a gentle guide that puts our humanist beliefs into action. Our topic today, at today's meeting, Epigenetics and Wound Healing, addresses the humanist commitment of critical thinking, which is truly the basis of the scientific method and discovery through evidence-based practice. HGP is an all-volunteer group that believes strongly in freedom of speech, but I must state that the views expressed by myself, our reader, our speakers, HGP members, and our guests at today's meeting are not the official views of the Humanists of Greater Portland. Our third scholarship winner and final scholarship winner will be reading her essay this morning. I'd like to welcome Kay Byerly, who will be introducing Kristen Balk. Come on in, Kay.
Anyway, it's my pleasure to introduce our scholarship winner, Kirsten Balk. She's a woman of many talents. I'll give you a small sampling of the variety of things that she has done while she was in high school. She graduated from Westview High School in Beaverton. She was involved in an amazing number of extracurricular activities, soccer and basketball. I think she's a Renaissance woman, you might say. She was in the marching band, playing alto sax, and a jazz band. She was secretary for science in the National Honor Society. She achieved the Girl Scout Gold Award, and having been a Girl Scout member for years. And one of the more interesting things to me was she was a data science intern at Western Aerospace Scholar and a Western Aerospace Scholar at the University of Washington. She and her team designed a mission to Mars, and she was in charge of costing out the program, and I think the engine that got them there. She's going to Northern Arizona University in the fall and tells me she's interested in bioinformatics. So anyway, it's my pleasure to hand the microphone over to Kirsten. Welcome.
Hello, thank you. The squeak of an expo pen rang in my ears as my teacher paced in front of the class, drawing an old-fashioned scale, like the one I'd used to represent America's justice system. How do we find the balance between liberty, he pointed to one side of the scale, and order, he asked the class. We sat in silence, the question too large for us to know where to start. It was mid-February 2020. We were at the beginning of the semester-long class. We were supposed to gain enough knowledge to become an informed member of the American democracy. Yet his question seemed irrelevant and too great for any one person to make a difference. Little did we know we would soon be facing the question, as the state would go into lockdown just over a month later. And we'd find that individuals indeed make this decision between the balance of liberty and order. The fight between individual freedom and the common good is decades old. It was there in the early 20th century when the Spanish flu spread throughout the nation, and there when smallpox ravaged towns across the land. At this time, people would try and oppose mandatory vaccination laws that were common in several states, such as Massachusetts and Wisconsin. Yet, when they entered into the court system, the judges ruled against them by establishing the right for the government to enact health laws of every description to protect the common good. In this case, it seems that in the case of pandemics or other serious health concerns, the government has the right to overrule all personal freedoms in the name of the common good. This power remained virtually unchallenged throughout the first 3/4 of the century. It wasn't until the 1970s that the HIV and AIDS epidemic tipped the balance between the common good and personal freedom in a new direction. As HIV and AIDS swept throughout the country, many legal battles over privacy rights and individual liberties ensued, and more personal liberties were allowed. This leads us to our current moment. When COVID-19 hit and lockdowns went up, and later when mask mandates became law, pushback ensued. Soon videos of people not wearing masks and being told to leave a business popped up all over social media. The fight for personal freedom over common good became a political debate, with Democrats generally arguing for more common good policies and Republicans generally arguing for individual freedom. Yet the question of how much individual liberty we are willing to give up should not be the determining factor in how we strike a balance between personal freedom and common good. Instead, we should be asking, what kinds of information do health officials need to do their jobs? What research actually supports any health mandates being enacted? And are there any options to get the same information or reach the same goal? In the case of a public health crisis, the best way to balance the scale is through hard evidence and research. If health policies are backed with evidence and research has shown that they have tried alternative methods that allow for more personal freedom to reach the goal of ending the spread of the disease, then more people are likely to heed government advice, especially if they feel that their concerns about personal freedom are being heard. Suppose laws are mandated at research instead of at will by the government, like in the earliest 20th century. In that case, people are more likely to feel that their personal freedoms are being respected, especially if they're given other options to continue to engage in their daily activities. If we look at the current pandemic and how people reacted to the introduction of the lockdown, we see the balance between personal freedom and the common good was shifted over time. At first, most people were willing to lose some of their freedom, such as going to concerts or movies, out of the idea that this would stop the pandemic's spread. Over time, though, as mandates stayed the same and cases continued to rise, people grew frustrated. They're losing their freedom, but it seemed as if it was all for naught. As such, protests started and unsafe interaction resumed. Soon a pattern formed, where there would be tough lockdowns and a release of restrictions. This caused whiplash, as people were told to not do one thing and immediately told it was fine. As such, faith in public health officials dropped. Instead of providing relatively safe solutions that were low risk, public health officials cautioned everyone to stay on lockdown, which is not realistic for most people. This in turn caused more people to engage in dangerous behaviors as they were not given alternative suggestions and felt as if their voices were not being heard. Our current day-to-day life shows that the only way to safely balance individual freedom and the common good during a pandemic is to discourage high-risk activities while suggesting and encouraging low-risk activities so that most people feel like their voices are being heard. This will also lead to less whiplash, meaning that public will be more likely to listen to healthcare advisors. Although it's hard to find the right balance between the common good and individual freedoms, we must do our best to empathize with all people while listening to research so that we can move forward together through such a life-changing event. Thank you.
I have a question. You talked about less, less restrictive. Can you think of what a less restrictive activity you would have encouraged our governor, Kate Brown, to encourage people to do during the pandemic restrictions?
I would have suggested encouraging people to this was later on, it was encouraged, sure. But in the beginning, encourage people that they're still to be able to meet outside and to socially distance and masked, but still so they can meet with other people, because I think a lot of people felt very cooped up and that they couldn't just handle that cooped up for so long.
Yeah, it did feel cooped up, and and I think once we were able to, even in winter coats, wrapped up with the heaters, and we did feel better about being able at least to talk to friends. That idea of who can be in your bubble. It's my honor to welcome today's speakers, Dr. Rebecca Bryan and Dr. Janice Beitz, who will be presenting on epigenetics and its effect on healing. Dr. Bryan will be our first presenter, and she is the Director of Community Engagement and the Professional Development at Rutgers University of Nursing. Her passion is to raise interprofessional awareness about trauma-informed approaches to care, particularly about the impact of childhood adversity on adult health and well-being. She is a board-certified licensed nurse practitioner and is also certified in trauma-informed care. She has 20 years of experience working as a primary care nurse practitioner and is active in her community as a volunteer in social justice initiatives. Dr. Beitz, our second presenter, is a professor of nursing at Rutgers University with 45 years of teaching experience. She is a board-certified licensed nurse practitioner and has received a variety of honors, including Masters of Wound Care Award from the American Professional Wound Care Association. She is a fellow of the American Academy of Nursing, and in 2018, she was inducted as a fellow of the National Academics of Practice for Nursing. I'd like to, coming to us from the great state of New Jersey, it is my honor and true joy to please welcome Dr. Bryan and Dr. Beitz.
Yeah, we're so excited to be with you today. And this presentation is a combination of two talks that we've given. And it reflects two articles, one of which has been published and the other one is pending being published, on the impact, well, really how your lived experience becomes your biology and the wisdom of the body. And so that's what we'll be talking about today. I will be giving the, you could say I'll be discussing the biologic plausibility of what we're suggesting, and then Dr. Beitz will be reviewing the science that demonstrates the strong associations. Before I begin, I just want to make you all aware that I will be talking about the impact of childhood trauma on health across the lifespan. And that means that I will be talking about subjects that can be triggering for some people. And so I really encourage self-care during this time, whether it's turning your camera off, doodling, moving, breathing through it, but listen to your body. And I'm hoping by the time my time is done, you will want to listen to your body. So without further ado, hopefully everyone can see the slides.
Yes.
And we'll begin. So we're both from Rutgers. Okay, so I do want to start with trauma because our childhood experiences so profoundly impact our epigenetic expression across the lifespan. And this is my favorite definition of trauma. Trauma happens when any experience stuns us like a bolt out of the blue. It overwhelms us, leaving us altered and disconnected from our bodies. And you see I have a picture and I actually have a slinky because I think when you understand these life experiences as energy forces that either are expressed through our movement or get trapped in our body, then it helps a lot to understand what's going on here. And I like this definition because it shows that trauma is incredibly common, because really, who at some point in their life hasn't had something that just stuns them? And it shows that it can happen at any age. A lot of times when we hear trauma, we think of veterans returning from war, but there are actually way more American children and adults walking around with vestiges of traumatic and toxic stress experiences from their lives. And then finally, it's not so much what happened to you as how you experienced it. So there are some people who have the exact same experiences, and one person holds on to it and it's something that comes back to them again and again and again. And there are other people, likely because they had the space and the support to process it, that it was allowed to move through them and they were able to let go of it. And so again, keeping that energy in mind is critically important. I also, especially coming off of the pandemic, a lot of times when you talk about trauma, you think, well, I never really had anything traumatic happen to me. Like I never really had any horrible experiences or anything. And so I think it's way more useful to think about toxic stress. And toxic stress is that kind of stress which overwhelms the coping mechanisms. We know that some stress is good. There is such thing as positive stress, and there is an intermediate stress that usually hits you pretty hard, but you've got the support and the wherewithal to process it. But toxic stress overwhelms the system. And so what you end up having is you end up having adverse events or exposures, that you're in a system, you're in a context that's uncontrolled, unmanageable, unmediated by supports. This in turn causes a lot of inflammation from the stress hormones repeatedly given off. So you end up with biological and psychological changes, and then you have a reduced opportunity for healthy learning and development. And unfortunately, in our country, way too many children are growing up in toxically stressful settings, whether it's concentrated urban poverty or rural poverty, or it can be really super. I live in a very wealthy town, and I still know children who are hurting themselves in all sorts of ways because of the overwhelming stress in which they live. And ACEs is the term for adverse childhood experiences. There is a ton of research on it. I know just south of you, you have California, and the first time a state has chosen a Surgeon General, but Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris is a huge advocate and expert on adverse childhood experiences. And traditionally, the research has looked at 10 types of childhood trauma or toxic stress dysfunctional household, and you will find a lot of examples of those in the tree here, in the green of the tree. And it is important to point out that toxic, like dysfunctional households, can create toxic stress that can impact your biological expression. But there are other kinds of traumas as well that impact children's growth and development. And that includes the community, which you see listed here in the roots, and then the environment, which you see listed as number 3 with the tornado. I think the big difference between environmental traumas and community and household is that environmental tends to be something that is situational. It happens, it might be awful. I mean, we've been witnessing it the past couple of weeks globally, how much people are suffering, and it's not to minimize that suffering. But the thing is that when it's occurring in a household, or it's occurring maybe right in your neighborhood, that is relational. And relational trauma, relational toxic stress, children not receiving good enough parenting really has this intense impact, profound impact on our body minds. And so we must name that, and we must recognize it. And then, lest this be a horribly depressing talk the entire time, what's really neat that's coming out in research more and more is this concept of positive childhood experiences, or PACEs. They're also known as counter ACEs, and there's like 4 or 5 terms right now being used. If you want to look into this a little bit more, there's a really great researcher out of Johns Hopkins University. Her last name is Bethel, and she's doing wonderful work around flourishing in children and in life. But these are examples of positive experiences that children have. And what's really neat is when you have a number of positive childhood experiences in your world, it can counteract, it can mitigate, or even remove the impact of adverse childhood experiences. And so this is something that's being explored more and more. And also it points to ways that we can make a difference in a child's life, by being the one safe adult that they can come to, or to be a good neighbor, or to provide opportunities to have a good time, and to provide a lot of predictability in school. So really, really important to understand this. Okay, this is a great graphic from the CDC, and the CDC has a lot of information about the adverse childhood experiences studies, which were originally done through the CDC and through Kaiser Permanente in San Diego, actually. And at this point, over easily 600, 700,000 adults, if not more, have been asked the questions of adverse childhood experiences, and then tracked to see what kind of health outcomes come of that. And so while this research is largely retrospective, looking back, there is increasing amounts of prospective research, and just the sheer numbers are strongly demonstrating associations, as well as the neuroscience is beginning to demonstrate biological plausibility of these. So if you look at this adverse childhood experiences, look at the impact it has in adults. It more than doubles your risk of any cancer or diabetes. If you have a score of 4 or more, it markedly increases your use of unhelpful substances, alcoholism, drug use, impacts education, outcome, occupation, and income. So contributing to 7 out of 10 of the leading causes of death in the United States. I'll run through the original 10 categories quickly because, again, so much of the research is based on that. It is physical, sexual, emotional abuse, physical and emotional neglect. And then with household dysfunction, if you're living with someone who has been incarcerated, who struggles with mental illness, who, if you witness domestic violence, if you lose a parent to divorce or separation, and if you live with someone who is abusing a substance. Now that could be cigarettes, marijuana, and then go up from there. Each of these counts as 1 point for a max of 10. And again, I really encourage, if you want to learn more about ACEs, if you don't know about it, look at the CDC, excellent resources there. So we're going to look for a few minutes at the science that's demonstrating the plausibility between the association of ACEs, having had ACEs, and your likelihood of chronic disease, as well as, again, occupational impact and really social success in life. And we're going to look at brain development, genetic expression, and what's called allostatic load. So brain development, the brain forms from the bottom up when we are in utero. And when an infant is born, the first 2 parts of their brain is formed. I'm using the hand model of the brain here, which is created by Dr. Siegel. And the lowest part of your brain is that reptilian brain, the red, and that's always worried about, am I safe? And then the blue is your limbic system, which is your emotional brain. And that's represented by folding your thumb over. And it is the limbic system and the lower survival brain that are fully formed. You would not fit through the birth canal if your cortex had also been formed. So while the neurons are all there, they are not connected yet. And it is up to the parent, the healthcare provider, the caregiver, to act as the cortex for that young infant, helping to provide context, to give explanations, to name emotions. And the amazing miracle of life is that for the first 3 years of life, the brain makes 1 million connections every second. And those connections are completely based on lived experience. As adults, and actually as children, we are always functioning out of one of these areas of the brain. So we can be functioning out of survival mode, no words. We can be functioning out of emotional limbic mode. I get upset at very neutral things, or I can be very future thinking. That's when the lid's down and we are able to use our rational brains. If you have a lot of trauma in your early childhood, your lower brain is going to wire more densely, as is your limbic system. And so it's more likely that when you have a trigger, which could be in a perfectly safe situation, it's going to bring you down faster. You're going to flip your lid and you're going to react. And I also think, again, with the slinky, about the fact that if you're really stressed and that energy gets trapped, when you hit a trigger, it's going to escape, right? As illness, as screaming, as dissociation, as shutting down. And then we do have the impact of childhood trauma on epigenetic expressions. So we get half of our genes from each of our parents, and that is called the genetic template. And it turns out that only 2% of genetic expression is due to that genetic template. The remaining 98% is mediated by these proteins that float around. They're called epigenomes, and they are the connection between the environment, the outside world, and our bodies. And that is what's profoundly impacting how our genes are expressed. So what happens is if you have a lot of toxic stress in early childhood, or even honestly, even in adulthood, it's going to mark the chromosomes in such a way, it doesn't change the chromosomes, but what it does is it impacts the histones that the genes wrap around. It impacts, it leaves a methylation. And these things actually alter the instructions for creating proteins. And so you might have a lot more of a higher risk of cancer expression or cardiac disease, the way your body handles stress in and of itself, how many cortisol receptors you have in your brain. This is all driven by this epigenetic impact. And what's neat is that when you have positive childhood experiences, or if a child's world shifts from being super stressful to more stable, and the parents maybe got good in education, that can be shifted as well, which is really cool. And then the other piece about genetics is that at the ends of the chromosomes, where you see the orange here, these are called telomeres. They're like the ends of shoestrings, and they protect the genes from unraveling when they are replicating. And so that holds them together. When infants are first born, these telomeres are very long. And by the time you become frail, elderly, they're almost down to nothing. Traumatic experiences prematurely shorten telomere length, which is why they think that the risk for cancer is so much increased also, that plays a role. And it's also why we know that people who have ACE scores of 6 or more are likely to die 20 years younger than someone who has an ACE score of 0. And so we really think that this telomere impact also plays a role in that. All that to say, I'll say it again and again, that means that you are at risk. It does not mean it's a done deal, and healing is possible. And then finally, we're increasingly realizing how much adverse childhood experiences can even impact our microbiome, which is the gut, the bacteria and all the little cutie bugs in our guts. And they actually talk to our brains through neurological connections. Really quickly, I also want to talk about this because I don't want you to walk away without realizing how important it is to listen to the body. And so as I speak of this, think about the fact that when everything's going well, your inflammation is down, your epigenetic expression is better. When you're super stressed out and your body's giving all sorts of messages to the brain, everything is not going so well, and your inflammation is increased, and that is going to influence epigenetic expression as well. So we have 3 brains. We have gut, heart, head. All of them have their own nervous systems and give off hormones. In fact, 90% of our serotonin, which is, a happy hormone that helps with anxiety and depression, and we take medicine for it a lot, that is actually made by your gut. And oxytocin, a lot of our oxytocin, which is the tend and befriend hormone, is made by your heart. Then what connects our body to our minds is the vagus nerve. And what's really interesting is that 80% of the messages are going up. So whereas we generally like to think that our brains are the CEO of our bodies, it's actually the opposite is true. Most of the messages are coming from our bodies going up to our brains. And then it's actually our lowest survival brain, which again is below the level of words, is deciding if the information coming from the body and the senses is even safe enough to go up to your thinking brain. So your body and your body language, your facial expression, what your organs are doing are all going to do their own thing if you feel like you are under threat. And we have this autonomic nervous system, which is the vagus nerve, which is parasympathetic. And then you've got your sympathetic nervous system, which is fight or flight. And most of us who are in the sciences have grown up hearing about the two, sympathetic, parasympathetic. But it turns out that mammals have evolved to have three distinct systems. You have the dorsal vagal branch, which is really, really, really old evolutionarily. And that is what connects to your lower organs and goes up into the brain. And so when you know things deeply by your gut, that is that dorsal nerve communicating with your brain. But we also have this ventral vagal complex, which is connected to our hearts and our breath and our voice box and our ears, the way the little bones in our ears turn so we can hear better. It's connected to our facial muscles. And that is called the social engagement complex. And it turns out that we can't be calm. We can't have our lids down. We can't learn new information unless we are in a safe and social setting. And so you've got out of this what's called the polyvagal ladder. We can be functioning out of the ventral vagal complex. And this is like when you're safe and warm. Your arms are strong but gentle. Someone may hold you close, but you're not being restricted in a frightening way. Or you're in your sympathetic fight or flight, and it's fear, and you've got to move and you've got to escape, and nobody can be trusted, no place is safe. Or the threat is so bad that your mind decides that I got to shut down because I do not want you feeling that bear when he eats you. And so I'm far away in a dark and forbidding place, and I make no sound, I'm small and barely breathing. We go up and down this ladder based on how stressed out we are. When we feel threat, we go down the ladder. And then when we release that energy, when we are surrounded with love, when we are with somebody else to be corrected, then we come back up that ladder to the safe and social. And finally, a term I'd like you to have is this whole idea of neuroception. So when we are engaging with people, when we are out in crowds, we are picking up signals all the time, which are in turn impacting how stressed we are, how inflamed we are, how calm we are, and thereby impacting genetic expression. And so our ability to sense danger is called neuroception. And that information is coming from our 5 senses, plus what our organs are telling us. So if we are in a scary situation all of a sudden, and we stop digesting because all the energy goes to our muscles so that we can fight or flight, our stomach being full and not digesting is communicating through the vagus nerve to our brains. And so you've got this whole, you can read everything, you're picking up other people's facial expression, body language, all of it constantly below the level of consciousness. And in knowing this, we can understand why groups respond together. Think of Charlottesville. We can understand why when we are in the presence of someone whom we trust and is calming, we too are co-regulated by that person. And this, to me, just teaches how much power we have with others to make the world better. Call me an eternal optimist. Because when you know this stuff, you know that you can influence others in a good way based on what you know about your body and how you hold yourself. There is not time, but I just want to make you aware that there are actual approaches to trauma-informed care that are being developed. And the encouragement is that across social sectors, regardless of what profession you're in, every organization, every profession would benefit from being trauma-informed. And before I hand it over to Dr. Beitz, this is the fun aha we both had together researching our first article, which is that adverse childhood experiences generate risk factors that are the risk for wounds and for healing. So you see them here where the overlap is: alcoholism, depression, diabetes, immobilization, immune dysregulation, malnutrition, obesity, smoking, substance use, and vascular disease, all strongly associated with ACEs and associated with developing wounds.
Dr. Beitz, welcome. I hope you'll start your presentation now, and then we'll have time for questions.
So one of the things I wanted to mention, it was on the previous slide, and that is traditionally in healthcare, we have been taught the idea of taking a history and a physical. The science of ACEs and adverse childhood experiences is suggesting now that our history is our physical. So taking a good history is really trying to find out comprehensively what has happened to the individual that you're interacting with, particularly in childhood. Your childhood experiences impact your adult health. So what are we talking about here? It came out of a failed weight loss study that was conducted by Kaiser Permanente. Vince Felitti was the lead physician, lead researcher, and he talked about this whole issue of obesity, a not so hidden epidemic anymore. It's across the world. The comment that struck me when I was reading this research, that he says, nobody becomes fat out of joy. One of the things that resonated with me when I learned about this whole area of adverse childhood experiences, I was the student and Dr. Bryan was the teacher, because it was part of her DNP project to educate faculty about this whole area of emerging science. And I thought, I'll be very honest, my area is adult gerontology. I thought, oh, here we go with another pediatrics topic. But the reality is the science is compelling. And when I started to read this literature about obese populations, that is a huge component of the patients I take care of as a wound care specialist. Many of them were obese, and a significant amount were also morbidly obese. And I found in looking at the literature things that really resonated with me. And I had been looking at these factors and not recognizing them when I was doing wound care. The bottom line is, in obese humans, the endocannabinoid system is chronically activated due to excess visceral fat. The adipocytes, the fat cells in our bodies, particularly white adipose tissue, it's an endocrine organ. When morbidly obese people have these huge panniculus, what they call huge apron of fat on their abdomen, that tissue acts as an endocrine organ to affect how their body heals, and heals things, including wounds. So we know that if you have excess body fat, it really increases the risk for what I call bad inflammation. Now, normally in wound healing, what's the body do? We stop bleeding. We send in cells that will clean up the wound, the dirty tissue. That's called inflammation. That's good inflammation. Then we grow tissue to heal the wound, and then it matures over a couple years' time so that that area is relatively strong again. You get about 80% of normal strength back in an area that's wounded. But in people that have issues like adverse childhood experiences, higher levels at higher scores, or people, for example, that are morbidly obese, they don't have good inflammation, they have chronic inflammation. And therein is the difference, because chronic levels of inflammation are not good for the body as we age particularly. And one of the interesting, fascinating areas of this is the gut microbiome. We are with the article we wrote about that is in review right now. We hope it gets accepted. The emerging science of that is enormous. So what's this? What are we talking about here? This whole area of epigenetics and ACEs, our lived experience as children impacts our adult health. You saw the slide that linked risk factors that are related to, correlated to higher ACEs scores are the same factors that are associated with wounds forming. But once you have some of those issues, those disease states can actually influence your ability to heal. So it's a big aha we had. It's not just wound generation. Epigenetics plays a role in wound healing. There have been interesting studies that show this, particularly in Holocaust survivors, that this influence, the change in your body occurs in the parents, and it is transmitted to offspring. And we have a list of references at the end of this presentation. We recommend strongly that you go investigate these areas yourself. There is an emerging science about epigenetics and the influence on adult health from adverse experiences in childhood. I mentioned the issue of inflammatory links. We know from research that's been published that childhood trauma contributes to chronic inflammation at midlife. Vascular disease is hugely linked to chronic inflammation in the vascular system. They've done a study, almost 1,200 middle-aged and older adults. If you have a higher ACEs score, you have higher inflammatory indices measured through norepinephrine levels. So what does this mean? It means one of the disease processes that is associated with higher ACEs score mediated by obesity is type 2 diabetes. Multifactorial bacterial issues going on here. There's a lot of cellular and humoral activity going on, but we know, to put it in simple terms, diabetes affects our ability to heal a wound. For example, a fasting blood sugar above 180 absolutely impacts the ability of white blood cells to work. It's a known relationship. It's well known in the literature. We also know that epigenetic changes impact the bone marrow, the cells that help form the inflammation, the healthy inflammation. So we know epigenetics influences diabetes through macrophage activity. Macrophages are white cells that go in there like Pac-Man and they chew up the bacteria and clean up the wound. So we know that there's this interaction with the environment if somebody is diabetic. Next slide. So how does epigenetics influence wound generation? The risks for wounding, they were listed on that slide before with the Venn diagram. We know that higher ACEs are associated with eating disorders, cardiometabolic poor outcomes, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, all kinds of mood and psychiatric disorders, and risk behaviors, the behaviors that make us at risk to develop wounds, like cigarette smoking, like alcohol use, risky sexual behaviors, heavy drinking. Higher ACEs are associated with that. And the thing that is compelling is that these research studies are being done, as Dr. Bryan mentioned, retrospectively, looking back to see if there's a relationship, but now prospectively, going forward, measuring people at this point in time, and then looking how it emerges maybe 10 or 20 years later. And they are showing a strong relationship in both types of studies. So I found this fascinating. This is a study that was done in Utah where they have great genealogical records. They looked at outcomes in people that had surgical site infections, and they looked at the relative risk for their third-degree relatives, and it was higher in people that were related to individuals with surgical site infections. And the authors talked about human genetic susceptibility to SSIs. There was a positive relationship in the people that were related to these individuals that had the surgical site infection. Then the question is it a genetic relationship entirely, or, as the researchers suggested, much more of an epigenetic influence because of the environmental factors, because these people all lived relatively close to one another. So they've also looked at ACEs associated with other kinds of disorders, like being a disabled adult. There's something called the BRFIS, which is the Behavioral Risk Factor Survey that's put out by the federal government. And they looked at surgical weight loss outcomes. If you have a higher BRFIS score, you're going to have a higher risk of having disability. And that went along with the higher ACEs ranking that was part of the BRFIS. Same thing with surgical weight loss outcomes. If you have a higher ACEs score, and that means, if you remember what Dr. Bryan said, 4 or above of a scale of 10, and these studies, they found out that there was less weight loss post-bariatric surgery. So there's something going on here, correlation between higher ACEs score and poor outcomes in adults. Next slide. So how does this influence wound healing? Talked about wound generation. What's going on with epigenetics? Epigenetics controls or regulates the processes of skin repair. Epigenetic regulators dynamically regulate keratinocyte proliferation. Keratinocytes are the cells that make your epithelium. It helps with their differentiation. It helps with dermal regeneration. We were talking earlier about microRNA and the role it's played in the development of vaccines. That's also part and parcel of skin health as well. We're learning a lot more about this whole area. There's 3 epigenome processes: DNA methylation, histone protein modification, and a regulation of non-coding microRNAs. They are affecting literally the cells that help us heal. This is science now. This is not, gee, I guess there's a relationship. No, there is a science that's emerging from this. This is entirely different from what I learned when I went to nursing school 5 decades ago. Now, I can't believe it's that long, but it's the truth. This man and man study talked about people that had cirrhosis of the liver. They found that there was a relationship in the subsequent generations that they were at higher risk for cirrhosis of the liver too. It's very interesting to see what the relationships are, the impact of environment and genetic code. And you heard what Dr. Bryan said, the influence on how these diseases are expressed is much more influenced by the epigenomes, not the genetic code. So related to all of this, and this is the other article that we are waiting to hear about, but the gut microbiome, we are learning more, and people are learning more in GI diseases. The gut microbiome, literally the bacteria that are in your GI tract, influence how your body can react to stress. The saying of the best way to a person's heart is through the gut, there is relationship to truth with that statement because of the impact, the importance of the bacteria in the GI system. And stressed individuals, research is supporting that, they have less healthy gut microbes. So you'll see often in GI diseases, you'll see the impact, they're looking at stress levels and how it impacts GI health. So what's this mean? Let's get down and dirty. What's the news you can use? So we know stress is an important regulator through epigenetics of upregulating genes or downregulating. That's well known. We know that psychological stress affects the immune system. That is well known. I learned that decades ago. Environmental issues, including social factors affecting gene expression related to wound healing, that's a much newer concept, much less known about that. You're going to see this area increase markedly. I've seen it in the last 3 years. And as Rebecca mentioned, you'll see some literature says 5%, some literature says 2% of genomic expression is related to the underlying genetic code, what you get from mom and dad. The rest of it is related to epigenetic influence. So acute and chronic wound healing is affected by social genomics. What's that mean? Social conditions. Things like do people have enough to eat? Do they have quality food? Or are they sitting at home eating Twinkies, thinking that that's good for protein levels? Are they unemployed? Do they have unstable housing? Are they uneducated? What are their lifestyle issues? If I could get wound patients to stop smoking, that would be a great event because cigarettes cause vasoconstriction and many patients have problems with peripheral arterial disease. If I could get them to stop smoking, that would be a great thing. But the issue is in thinking about ACEs and what they've experienced, for many people, smoking is part of their coping. And I have to have deeper insight into what's going on with this whole area. So traditionally, biological and social factors have been studied separately. Here's the patient's body, here's their wound, here's their personal lifestyle. And everything is saying now, these studies have to merge. When we're going forward in better science about wound healing, we have to look at the bigger picture. So Dr. Bryan referred to this earlier about the millions of children that are likely to be abused or neglected in the United States. 1 in 4 will have some type of childhood maltreatment. We know that chronic illness is going up markedly in adults while life expectancy is slowing down. And quite frankly, that's been really slammed by COVID. we've lost a couple of years in terms of life expectancy in the United States. When you see something like the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System, lovingly known as the BRFIS, when they have a module on adverse childhood experiences, this has risen to a level of importance because the science of epigenetics is driving better quality studies as we go forward. So what's this mean at the end of the day for quality wound care? We have to think about epigenetics and the biological embedding of social adversity. The body is keeping the score. We have to understand that things like epigenetic influences on body physiology, there are absolutely science-based mechanisms for that. Now, I went and did a special training program at NIH probably 6 or 7 years ago now, and I can remember driving up from Maryland up 95 with my eyes like this. It was mind expanding to understand what's going on with genetics and genomics and my need to learn that as a healthcare provider, but also to understand about my own body physiology. It was mind expanding. We know that epigenetic influences are functioning, they're altering brain anatomy and physiology. You heard Rebecca's great metaphor of flipping the lid when people have had enormous adverse childhood experiences. We also have to think about looking at the science showing the linkages between ACEs and adult chronic illness. There is a whole emerging science on psychoneuroimmunology showing how our body influences our later physiology based on what we live at a younger time. So for me as a provider, I think for you as a person who could potentially develop a wound, is that a good patient history, a good interaction with the healthcare provider who gets this is very helpful. I think it is critically important for everybody to be aware of the issue of sexual abuse. This is where I had the big aha. In the LTAC, the long-term acute care setting where I was working as a wound care specialist, I had many morbidly obese patients who had multiple problems. In learning about this and looking at the research, I saw that there's an enormous correlation, very strong, between sexual abuse in childhood and the development of morbid obesity development. And one of my colleagues, who's in another area of the country, works in a setting where she has many, many morbidly obese patients. She told me recently, because she has learned about this area as well, that every single 100% of her morbidly obese patients has been sexually abused as a child, 100%. And one of my psychiatric colleagues says, of course, because people are trying to build a wall of fat between themselves and outside risk. I thought that was an amazing metaphor. So the issue is we have to be aware of that I think in reading and understanding what's going on with some of the less obvious issues that are occurring with people that have morbid obesity, wound healing problems, that kind of thing. I think all of us have to understand this emerging science of adverse childhood experiences. And as I mentioned earlier, there is a huge impact of the patient's history on their physical exam. It is not history and physical. It is the history is the physical. To go back again for the risk factors for wounds, if you look at these factors listed here, they are also associated with higher ACEs score, and that is not just serendipity. The research adage is correlation is not causation. However, when you get into population-based studies where you have hundreds of thousands of patients that have been studied now and showing a strong relationship between higher ACEs score and adult pathology, and the pathology is associated with developing risk for wounds, then there is something going on here that's getting to a causative relationship. So for us as healthcare providers, but also I think for anybody who may have perhaps a relative, I had a morbidly obese sister and she had some serious issues in childhood. She had rheumatic fever and was away from us, from the family, for 3 years. She was institutionalized because they didn't have any way of preventing her getting exposed to other germs until they developed penicillin. Once she got put on penicillin as a young kid, she was able to come back home. She was literally away from the family for 3 years. Amazing. I think it's important to understand, and Dr. Bryan talks about this all the time, listening is an intervention. If we can understand the connection between ACEs and health outcomes, it can be healing. That's the great news about this. This can be healing. People can develop resilience. They can help take care of themselves. It's not like it's all over, there's nothing we can do. You can heal, you can get better. And now we're talking about this whole issue of epigenetic therapy, which I think is really fascinating. And for me, to put it down in terms of wound care, you have to focus on the whole patient, not the hole in the patient. Critically important to understand. Personally, how did I get dip my toe in this water, so to speak? I had to start reading. There's fascinating information available. CDC has wonderful resources on their website, but these are some of the journals that are out there to educate us about the science that is emerging about epigenetics and epigenomics. So I hope I've talked to you about the biological connection between ACEs and chronic illness. I've hoped that I've talked about ACEs' relationship to the high-risk behaviors that are associated with wound generation. And those same processes, those same diseases, if you want to call them that, can influence wound healing. Diabetes, classic example. Diabetes is associated with torpid wound healing. It's well known. And then I hope I've posed some practical implications for wound care practitioners. And we would welcome any questions that you have. You'll see after this slide is a whole list of references. We encourage you to read for yourself. There's fascinating information out there. We are learning along with you, and we welcome any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Wow. What a team. You two have, in less than an hour, have given us so much to think about, and we've got questions coming in.
I have a question about positive stress. For example, there's a critter called a tuatara. After it's hatched, if it's not exposed to sufficient ultraviolet light, it dies. And if it gets enough of it, it survives. What I've read is in Arctic lands that babies have to be born literally onto the ice to be shocked by the cold in order to survive. I'm not sure if that's accurate. I've heard of this. Can you give some examples of what you might call positive stress, where what we think of as harsh events actually have a positive effect on the person, and perhaps more in a social sense than in the ice or ultraviolet sense?
Mm-hmm. Thinking of resilience, sure. Kathy? Kind of resilience?
Possibly that it builds resilience, or that there's some other positive effect that it's really not. Intuitively, you think it's negative, but it isn't really.
Mm-hmm.
I can speak to it.
Okay,
so I could probably give a half-hour talk just on stress. Stress is not bad. Stress is very necessary, and indeed, there have been a generation of kids going off to college whose parents were helicopter parents, who have faced so little stress in their own lives that they literally cannot problem solve, and they are facing stress at school and they're failing out. And it's been demonstrated that if a mother, a pregnant woman, is carrying, experiences stress and then recovers from the stress, so you've got that up and down of the cortisol, the fetus actually, when the baby's born, demonstrates more resilience, has a stronger immune system. And so stress is really critically important for our well-being. The kind of stress I was talking about is toxic stress, again, that overwhelms the coping mechanisms, and it tends to be prolonged and intense for a long period of time. And again, I'm thinking of the kids I've worked with in Camden, New Jersey, which is one of the poorest cities in the country. And, you know, they have all their social determinants of health are a mess. And everybody's super stressed out and also struggling with racism, which is an ACE too, in my opinion.
Okay.
So hopefully I answered that.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr.
And
Bryan.
there's another example too, and that comes from
Yes.
education. There's very strong research that shows you where people are taking exams, when they're taking tests, a little bit of stress is actually good. It helps your brain work better. It helps you pick out cues and test questions. So a little bit of stress, a little bit of stress is positive for exam performance. When the stress becomes overwhelming, then it has a negative impact. So that comes out of the educational research literature, very strong relationship. A little bit of stress in a testing situation is good. I can tell you from working in the operating room for 10 years, a little bit of stress in the beginning was good because you had to learn to function to be on trauma call, and you didn't know what the heck was going to roll in the door. So you had to be able to do a gunshot wound to the chest, a craniotomy, and whatever happened when you were on call. And you're under stress for a while, but eventually that stress becomes helpful because you are able to function in a very fast way.
Thank you. Great answers. Dennis K has just a thought here. So the expression, "what doesn't kill me makes me stronger," is wrong. Like the idea that if something's so overwhelming, it doesn't kill me, makes me stronger, is wrong.
So it depends.
Right, it depends.
It depends on what your support systems are. It depends on how many resilience factors you have in place. And really, the push is never assess someone's adverse childhood experiences without also assessing their resilience factors. Because it's really important to lean into those. And sometimes if you have the proper, again, support systems, your attachment style is healthy. I mean, there's so many, we're such complex beings. But if the proper factors are in place, it could be that a super stressful situation gives you the energy to do what you need to do. I have a slide in another presentation that is a group climbing Mount Everest. And when you're going to climb Mount Everest, you're going to be freezing cold. You're going to be starving hungry. You aren't going to have enough oxygen, but you're doing it because and you're using that energy to do it. The problem, I think, is that when we were baby nurses, we were taught that, and I think a lot of people were taught that children were resilient and we didn't have to worry about children. Matter of fact, Dr. Bruce Perry, who's another expert in this field, he's the one that wrote the book with Oprah Winfrey, What Happened to You. He talks about being called out to a house one time where there was a murder, and they were very concerned about the policeman that found the body and the adult who was losing someone. But meanwhile, against the wall were these little children, 3 and 4 years old, looking like this. And they said, oh, they'll be all right. Like, so they got, because they won't remember it, And the thing is what research shows undeniably now because of neuroscience is that when you have early childhood trauma, it is stored in your body. And again, that slinky, it's stored in the body. And the work by Candace Pert, the molecules of emotions, they're stored in your hips, they're stored in your low back. The work of Dr. Sarno that shows that your back pain is much more due to your stress levels and what's happened to you than what your MRI looks like. And so recognizing that it does not necessarily make you stronger if you're in a situation, a context where you can't help yourself and you're not being supported.
Thank you. Sheila Pastori just had a fabulous presentation, her comment. I wanted to thank you. Al Christians has a question. Come on, Al.
Yes, a question for Dr. Bryan. You showed your diagrams of the human self as kind of an information processing system with all these influences flowing in and through the various systems of the body, and that you kind of suggested that the feelings at the center of it are getting a good sense from all these inputs of what's really going on. But my question relates to the fact that we didn't evolve to know what's going on. We evolved to survive, and that if disinformation will help you survive, probably, evolution might have found a way to fool us about ourselves in some ways as well. Are there any ways where the information coming in is either not accurate, or where these information systems are somewhat obsoleted by the changes in human conditions from moving rapidly from a fairly savage state to a fairly civilized state?
Well, that's an easy question. Not.
I know. He's famous. He's famous for these questions. So just everybody knows he's going to ask them.
Let me see if I can understand that. So first off, we understand things through the lens of our lived experience. And so if something's going to trigger us, it's based on past experience. But what we know because of the neuroscience, so for instance, I talk a fair amount about cortisol receptors in the brain. If you grow up in a healthy, loving situation with good enough parenting, and you're fed when you're hungry, your diapers change, your moods are reflected by the person who's engaging with you regularly, then what you're going to do is you're going to form cortisol levels all over the brain. And so if you have a hit of stress, it's going to be absorbed quickly because you've got so many receptors. If you grow in a home where you're neglected, or you witness a lot of domestic violence, or physically you're not cared for as well as emotionally, or you're hearing gunshots every single night, then what's going to happen is your brain will not make as many cortisol receptors. And because after a period of time, the brain's wiring rapidly together, but if you're not being stimulated and engaged and loved and touched and nurtured, then after a while, the brain prunes parts of your brain that's not being used. And so that person, when they grow up, they have that cortisol surge, and it stays longer because you don't have those cortisol receptors. I think in terms of evolution, I fully agree that we are wired first and foremost for survival. There's no doubt about that. But I just think that the bear in the woods, the tiger, just changes shape. And so I think what I worry about now is that technology has evolved so rapidly, and the threats to children now are completely different. It's what are people writing on Snapchat and Instagram, and am I rated the highest or the lowest? And and also, frankly, you see a child kidnapped in Illinois, and you won't let your child go out in New Jersey. It's the threats are so different, but I don't think so. Maybe we're taking in different things. In that way, I see the evolution of society impacting us. But I also am excited about this research because it's demonstrating that the more we understand ourselves, the more self-aware we are, and the more aware of the impact we have on other people, just through co-regulation, can really begin to make a difference in people's lives. And so I don't know. I hope I answered that adequately, but
Yes.
but that's my thinking.
You did. Thank you. We have a question from Jamila. I understand from my reading that MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction, can actually increase telomere length. Is that true?
So very, very, I don't know, Dr. Beitz, if you've actually seen, I haven't actually seen a research article on that, but it wouldn't surprise me. Mindfulness is the #1 way to heal the brain from trauma. And what's fascinating is when kids are chronically stressed, the amygdala in the brain, which is the sentinel always scanning the environment, gets very big. And the precortex, which is where we hold new knowledge and executive function and our ability to connect with others, is smaller. When you meditate, when you practice mindfulness practices, your amygdalae are smaller, and your cortex grows. And you can also lower your cortisol levels, albeit not everybody. If you have a lot of trauma and being alone with yourself, being quiet is scary. I have had teens who go into full-blown panic attacks just at the word meditation. So, we need to respect where people are and realize that people are the experts on their own lives. So yes, that wouldn't surprise me.
Very good.
Healthy living has been shown to increase telomere length.
Wow.
Good sleeping, good eating, good exercise.
Excellent. Todd, you have a question. Come on in, Todd Kimball.
Thank you, Helen. And that was a powerful presentation. Thank you
Sure
so
was.
much. It's one of those I'm going to need to rewatch because there was so much information. My question is, you mentioned the concept of epigenetic therapy at the end. Can you give a little framework or definition of what that is?
I'll kind of address that. And that basically is to actually investigate what people's ACEs scores are. And remember the original work, Rebecca mentioned it, it was 10 factors that are the basic 10 ACEs. And anyone that has a 4 or above is at higher risk for developing adult problems, bad behavior, disease processes. I mean, if you go to the CDC, their resources are magnificent. And it's really eye-opening to see what the science is underlying this. But the Daddario is the one author that writes about it. If you understand that your patient had these ACEs and that they have these disease processes, it's sort of like the healing component that Rebecca was just talking about, that if you can take your weight down, if you can address this, that's a part of the epigenetic therapy of trying to address the disease processes that the patient has had, but also allowing the patient to talk about the fact that they have experienced ACEs. That's what we were talking about with listening. Listening itself is very clear in the literature, is therapeutic for people to be able to talk about it. It's not like they're going to get upset. My colleague who with the agreement of the patients and the health providers where she was working, talked to the morbidly obese patients. No one had ever asked any of them about their childhood. And 100% of them had been sexually abused as children. And not one of them got upset about it. Every single one of them felt better talking about it. That's part of the listening is therapeutic when people actually get to talk about their childhood and the bad times that they'd had there.
Thank you.
One of the original researchers, Dr. Anda, he likes to say that we need to create communities where people can speak about these things without shame and stigma. And it aligns with a lot of Brene Brown's writing, which is that, shame cannot survive in the presence of empathy. And so it's, but patients, I will say the caveat is people have to be ready in a place where they feel safe and social, where that ventral vagal complex is in control and their lid is down before you talk about these things. Because if you force somebody to talk about these things, you can re-traumatize them. And so, it's respecting. But the biggest hang up of screening patients for ACEs or just having discussions like this, it's the healthcare providers. The healthcare providers are like, not going there, not open up Pandora's box, or I don't have time in a 15-minute visit. But there's plenty of research to demonstrate it is feasible and it's acceptable in a primary care setting to do.
Thank you.
Dorman has a comment that he saw a psychiatrist in 1970 who said, all I needed was to learn to relax. He ended up being right, breathing and contracting his muscles. He learned to do that. So he agrees with you strongly. Dave DiNucci has his hand up. Come on in, Dave.
No, it's Dave Gray.
Oh, sorry. Dave Gray.
Yeah, thanks. The obesity pandemic has been, anybody who's paying attention sees that it's increased like crazy. 30, 40, 50 years ago, you almost never saw an extremely obese person. Now the rate is shocking. And I think I have deduced correctly that you're saying that increase is due to, or mainly due to, ACEs. But I have naively thought that with cultural influences too, like the food industry is making it so easy and cheap to get foods that are, if you're addicted to food, they make that addiction even easier. So I'm trying to get an idea for, do you think those influences do provide part of the answer for the increase in the obesity rate?
Most definitely.
I'll start that. Yeah, it's not the causative factor. We're not saying that ACEs is the causative factor. We're saying it's playing a role. And the fact of the matter is obesity is increasing enormously, but not only in the United States, across the planet. It's increasing in childhood, which is another whole topic. And obesity is known to increase the risk for many diseases, including cancer. I've just read an article last week looking at cancer rates in the United States, and they were talking about obesity increasing the cancer burden in the United States as a really strong factor. So, Dave, we're not saying it's the factor. We're saying it may play a big factor. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think, I think one of the biggest shifts I made, well, I didn't really ever say this, but when you become trauma informed, it's really a shift, a paradigm shift. Instead of asking what's wrong with you, you ask it what happened to you, because when you understand the trauma, you understand the behavior. And when you look at things like food addiction, sex addiction, substance abuse addictions, they are the solution that the person came up with to cope with emotions that were so overwhelming, their brain perceived it to be life-threatening. And so, so when you do have somebody that has trauma, they may overeat as a coping mechanism to protect themselves or to make themselves big and threatening. But yes, for instance, antibiotic use in children who took a lot of antibiotics for ear infections because we thought that was the best way to treat them, they struggle with obesity because they just wiped out their microbiome. And, and so for me, the hope is that maybe we'll figure out how to replenish their biome in an effective way to treat that. So, recognizing how complex we are.
Wayne had a question. What is in the average ACE number? Is there in the United States, is there an average?
Yeah, well, so that too, not a super easy answer. When they did the original ACE study, it was done on population 70% white, 70% college educated. And what they found was that 2/3 of the participants had one, 40% had 2 or more, and 12.5% had 4 or more. Wow. And that shocked people. That just absolutely shocked people that it was so prevalent. And then this link, there was a dose response relationship between the ACE score and your number of life-threatening chronic diseases in adulthood. They replicated the study 20 years after the original study. And this time they went into 23 different states. They looked at over 200,000 patients. And what they found was that the prevalence overall and the connection with chronic disease remained the same, which has been replicated also by the CDC lots of times. But the difference is that if you grow up identifying as LGBTQIA, if you are a person of color in our country, or if you're growing up in poverty, whether it's urban or rural, then you are at marked increased risk for experiencing personal ACEs. And that's really because the parents are super stressed out too, especially with the poverty and racism. And then a lot of kids who are trying to name their gender and their sexual identity, a lot of them are bullied, and bullying is a huge ACE. So yes, ladies, they're common. They're very common.
Yeah, ladies, I'm afraid we have run out of time, and we have a list of questions that we're just going to have to stop to respect your time and our members. But this has been phenomenal. I cannot thank you enough for sharing your knowledge and your practical information on such a, scientific topic. I loved it. Just loved it.